At the grocery store, an elderly woman whispered, "The person behind you has been following you through every aisle." I looked back and saw him, blue jacket, dark hair. Days later, I discovered he was my brother I never knew existed, and everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. I'm a forensic accountant at McKinsey & Associates, specializing in uncovering financial deception in family court cases. I make $94,000 a year investigating lies people tell about money, assets, and hidden resources. What I never expected was to use those same skills on my own family. The elderly woman at Costco had been right. Blue jacket guy was following me. But as I'd learned later, he wasn't some random stalker. He was my 15-year-old half-brother, Sydney, trying to work up the courage to introduce himself to the sister he'd never been allowed to meet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Daniel's phone call. 3 days after the grocery store incident, my ex-boyfriend from college called me out of nowhere. We'd been broken up for 3 years, and suddenly he needed to talk about something important. My first instinct was to hang up, but something in his voice made me hesitate. "I saw something at your sister's wedding last month that I can't stop thinking about," he said. "I need to tell you in person." Anne's wedding. I'd been the maid of honor, had given a speech about how family was everything, how we stick together through anything. The irony wasn't lost on me later. We met at Rittenhouse Square the next day. Daniel looked nervous, kept adjusting his sunglasses even though it was cloudy. "How were you even at Anne's wedding?" I asked. "You weren't on the guest list." "Eugene's my cousin. He's friends with Troy, and I was his +1. He paused, studying my face. "I saw your mother there." I actually laughed. "Daniel, my mother died when I was 12. Car accident, closed casket funeral. You've literally seen the photos in my dorm room." "That's what I thought too," he said quietly. "But the woman at table 8 was definitely Sheila. Same smile from those baby photos you used to keep. She looked right at me and recognized me from when we were dating." I stood up to leave, but something in his certainty stopped me. Daniel wasn't dramatic. He was an engineering major, methodical, not given to flights of fancy. I drove straight to Anne's apartment across town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Anne opened the door in pajamas despite it being 3 p.m. Red flag number 1 in my forensic training. "We need to talk about Mom," I said. Anne went pale. Actually pale. I'd seen this reaction before in depositions when someone knew they were caught. "What about her?" she asked, but her voice had that careful quality people use when they're buying time to construct a lie. "Daniel says he saw her at your wedding." Anne poured herself a glass of water with shaking hands. Another tell I recognize from work. When people lie about emotional topics, they get dry mouth, need to hydrate. "He must be mistaken," she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. That's what I told him. But he seemed so sure, Anne. Really sure. That's when my sister, the person I'd trusted most in the world, sat down at her kitchen table and destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. "She didn't die in that accident," Anne whispered. "Dad made it up. Mom left us for another man, and Dad couldn't handle telling us the truth. So he told us she died." I felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. "There was a funeral, Anne. I threw dirt on her casket." "Empty casket. Dad paid the funeral director to go along with it." I walked out without another word, drove aimlessly until I found myself at Dad's house in Center City. He took one look at my face and immediately knew Anne had cracked. "How could you lie about something like that?" I demanded. Dad invited me in, poured himself a scotch, at 4 p.m., which told me everything about how well he'd been handling this secret. "Your mother abandoned us for another man," he said, and I could hear 13 years of bitterness in his voice. "I thought it would be easier for you girls to think she died a hero than to know she chose to leave." "All these years," I started, but he cut me off. "I never expected her to come back, especially not to Anne's wedding." We talked until the sun set. Dad told me about the divorce papers Mom had filed, about finding the affair, about how she'd packed a bag one night and disappeared. He'd been a single father raising 2 grieving daughters while dealing with his own abandonment and betrayal. I understood his reasoning, but the magnitude of the deception was staggering. As a forensic accountant, I'd seen families lie about millions of dollars, but this was different. This was lies about the fundamental structure of reality. I needed to think, so I drove to the Whole Foods near my apartment. Something about grocery shopping always helped me process. I was turning into the dairy section when I froze completely. A woman with familiar eyes was studying the yogurt selection. Older, with different hair, but unmistakably my mother. She saw me at the exact same moment. Her hand froze on a container of Greek yogurt. For about 10 seconds, we just stared at each other like 2 deer in headlights. Then she put the yogurt back, adjusted her purse strap, and started walking toward the exit. I followed her. Not stalking, but I literally jogged to catch up. "Mom!" I called out. She stopped but didn't turn around. When I got closer, I could see her shoulders shaking. She turned, and I got my first clear look at her face in 13 years. Same green eyes I see in the mirror every morning. Same slightly crooked nose. But older, with lines around her mouth. I didn't remember from the hidden photos Dad kept in the attic. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked, as if we'd just seen each other last week. I actually laughed, a weird, hysterical laugh that made other shoppers stare. "I'm doing great, thanks for asking. Just found out my supposedly dead mother has been alive this whole time. So yeah, peachy." She flinched like I'd hit her. "Maybe we should go somewhere to talk," she suggested. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let her experience abandonment for once. But my forensic training kicked in. I needed information more than I needed revenge. We ended up at a 24-hour diner on South Street, the kind of place with sticky menus and a waitress who calls everyone honey. We sat in a booth near the back. She ordered coffee. I ordered a Coke because I was not going to pretend this was some casual catch-up over hot beverages. "I didn't know you'd be at the wedding," she started, but I cut her off. "Anne invited you." She nodded. "Troy's mother sent the invitation to my current address months ago. I debated for weeks before deciding to go." Current address. Like she'd been living somewhere all along, somewhere close enough to receive wedding invitations. "Where?" I asked, slipping into my professional interrogation mode. "Harrisburg." Harrisburg. An hour and a half away. For 13 years, she'd been 90 minutes from us. My forensic training has taught me that people reveal the most when they're trying to justify their actions, so I let her talk. "I understand you're angry," she said. "No," I replied. "I don't think you understand at all." I leaned forward, using the interview techniques I'd learned in my certification program. "I cried myself to sleep for 2 years thinking you were dead. I kept your photo under my pillow until I was 15. Dad had to get me therapy because I was having nightmares about car accidents." She started crying then. Real tears, not the pretty kind you see in movies. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said. "It was supposed to be temporary. I left because your father was controlling, suffocating. I needed space to figure out who I was. I was going to come back." "When?" I pressed, the way I do in depositions. She went quiet. Then she admitted the truth. "Maybe 6 months after I left, I tried. But your father told me if I ever contacted you girls, he'd make sure you never wanted to see me again. He said he'd tell you I'd abandon you for drugs, for money, for another man. He'd turn you against me completely." "So you just gave up?" "I was ashamed," she whispered, "and scared, and I convinced myself you were better off without me." Then she showed me something that made my stomach turn. Her phone filled with photos of me and Anne collected over the years from Facebook, Instagram, mutual friends, a digital scrapbook of the daughters she'd been watching from afar. "There was another man, wasn't there?" I asked, because in my work, I've learned there's always something people don't want to admit. Her face changed. "Timothy, we worked together." We'd been having an affair for 4 months before I left. At least Dad hadn't lied about everything. It ended within a year, she added quickly. Looking back, I made terrible choices. I was selfish and stupid. She was 32 when she left, not exactly a confused teenager. But here's where it gets complicated. She told me she'd tried to reach out when I was 16, sent a letter that Dad returned unopened, made phone calls he hung up on. She'd even driven by my high school once, but decided I looked happy enough without her. You don't get to make that call, I told her, my voice harder than I'd intended. You don't get to decide from a car window whether I needed my mother. We sat there for 2 hours. She told me about her life in Harrisburg, working as a secretary, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment with her cat named Button, volunteering at a food bank on Saturdays because helping people made her feel slightly less guilty about her own life. The bitterness in her voice when she said pathetic made me think she wasn't lying about the regret. Then she dropped the bomb that shattered what was left of my trust in my family. Anne knew, she said quietly. She reached out to me 3 years ago. I stood up so fast I knocked my Coke over. 3 years. Anne had been in contact with our supposedly dead mother for 3 years and never told me. I left cash on the table and walked out while my mother called after me. By the time I got to Anne's apartment, it was almost 10 p.m., but I didn't care. I pounded on her door until she opened it. She took one look at my face and knew exactly why I was there. "You've been talking to her for 3 years," I said. It wasn't a question. Anne tried to explain. Mom had found her on Facebook. She'd been scared and confused. She didn't know how to tell me. She claimed she was protecting me from getting hurt again. How was lying to my face for 3 years protecting me? I demanded. That's when Anne revealed the manipulation that had kept this secret for so long. She said Mom was fragile, that she'd been in therapy, that she'd tried to kill herself twice after leaving us, and Anne had been terrified that if she told me and I rejected Mom, it might happen again. Emotional blackmail. I was supposed to participate in some fake happy reunion to prevent our mother from hurting herself. Classic manipulation technique I'd seen in family court cases. I told Anne I needed space and left. I was done with everyone's lies and manipulation. When I got home, there was a text from Daniel asking if I was okay. I called him. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't lying to me. "Tell me exactly what you saw at the wedding," I said. He described sitting with Eugene at table 12, noticing a woman at table 8 who looked familiar. At first he thought she might be someone from college, but then he remembered the photos I used to keep in my dorm room, the one of my mom holding me as a baby. Eugene told me that was Sheila, that Troy's mom had invited her because they'd been friends back in the day. He didn't realize the connection to you until I explained. I asked why he'd waited so long to tell me, and he said he'd actually tried to bring it up casually the week after the wedding, but I'd been distant with him at the time. Then we broke up 2 months later, and he figured it wasn't his place anymore. Fair enough. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Anne and a voicemail from Dad asking me to call him urgently. I called Dad first. "She called me last night," he said without preamble. "After 13 years of silence, Sheila called and said she wants to be part of our lives again. She wants to make amends." "What did you tell her?" I told her no. I said I'd let her see Anne if Anne wanted that, but she needed to stay away from you. You're doing fine without her. "Who gave you the right to make that choice for me?" I snapped. Dad went quiet. "I was trying to protect you, like I always have." "Your protection has been lies for 13 years, I said, and hung up. That's when I realized something crucial. Everyone was trying to control this situation. Dad wanted to keep her away. Anne wanted to facilitate some happy reunion. Mom wanted forgiveness and a do-over. But nobody was asking what I wanted. And there was something else, something I hadn't told anyone yet. When I'd been leaving the diner after my conversation with Mom, I'd seen someone in the parking lot. Blue jacket guy from the grocery store, standing by a silver car, watching the diner entrance. When I drove past him, I got a clear look at his face. He looked exactly like my mother. I called my mother the next morning and told her we needed to talk immediately. "Can I bring someone?" she asked nervously. "Fine, whatever." An hour later, she showed up at my apartment with Sydney, the tall, nervous 15-year-old who'd been following me through grocery stores. "Sorry for being a creep," was the first thing he said. He explained he'd been trying to work up the courage to introduce himself for weeks, but kept chickening out. That day at the store, he'd finally decided to do it, but then the elderly woman had called him out, and he'd panicked. My mother told me everything then. She'd had Sydney 2 years after leaving us. His father had left when Sydney was a baby. She'd raised him alone in Harrisburg, 90 minutes away for 13 years. But here's what struck me as I watched Sydney's face while she explained. He looked as lost as I felt. This wasn't some evil plan. These were just broken people who'd made mistakes and were trying to figure out how to fix them. I asked Sydney what he wanted from this, and he said, honestly, he just wanted to know his sisters. He'd grown up hearing about us, seeing old photos, knowing we existed, but never being able to meet us. He said it felt like having ghost siblings. Something about that phrase got to me. I'd had a ghost mother, and it had been terrible. Sydney had ghost sisters. We'd all been haunted by people who were actually alive. I called Anne and told her to get to my apartment immediately. When Anne arrived and saw Sydney, her eyes went huge. "Holy shit," she said. "We have a brother." Sydney laughed nervously. "Yeah, surprise." We ordered Chinese food and sat around my coffee table asking Sydney about his life. He was in 10th grade, liked video games and basketball, had always wanted siblings, normal kid stuff. My mother sat quietly the whole time, barely eating, just watching the three of us talk. At one point, I caught her crying, and she quickly wiped her eyes and apologized. Anne asked if our mother had been a good mom to Sydney, and he got quiet. "She tried her best," he said carefully, "but she was sad a lot. There were days she could barely get out of bed. She worked constantly to provide for me, but emotionally, she was somewhere else." Our mother started crying harder then. She said she was sorry, that Sydney deserved better, that we all deserve better. She'd spent 13 years living with what she'd done, and it had destroyed her from the inside. Anne got up and hugged her without hesitation. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can figure out the future." I wasn't quite there yet, but watching Anne hug our mother while Sydney sat there looking like he might cry, I felt something shift. These were my people, broken and messy, but mine. Over the next few weeks, Sydney became a regular part of our lives. Mom would drive him down from Harrisburg on weekends. We went to a Phillies game, tried an escape room, did normal sibling stuff. It felt weirdly right. Mom joined us sometimes. At first it was awkward. None of us knew how to act around her. But slowly we started learning who she actually was, not just who we'd remembered or imagined. She told us about her job as a secretary, her apartment with her cat button, how she volunteered at the food bank because helping people made her feel slightly less guilty about her own life. Anne asked her about leaving Dad, and Mom finally told us the full story. Dad had been controlling in ways that made her feel suffocated, wanting to know where she was every minute, who she talked to, what she spent money on. She'd felt like she couldn't breathe. That didn't make leaving okay, but it made it make sense. She'd met Timothy at work, and he'd made her feel seen and valued in ways she hadn't felt in years. When Dad found out about the affair, the marriage exploded. She'd left planning to get space and figure things out. But Dad had told her if she wanted out, she was out completely. No halfway measures, she'd panicked and run. By the time she'd calmed down enough to think clearly, Dad had already told us she was dead. Sydney mentioned finding letters she'd written to us over the years. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, letters about her life that she'd written but never sent, just kept in a box in her closet. She brought that box to Anne's place one Saturday. Inside were years of correspondence addressed to me and Anne, cards for birthdays we'd celebrated without her, little presents she'd bought but never given us, photos she'd collected from mutual friends. Reading those letters broke something in me because I could feel her pain in every word. She hadn't forgotten us. She hadn't moved on. She'd been trapped in her own guilt and grief for 13 years. One letter from my 16th birthday said she'd driven by my high school that day and seen me laughing with friends. She wrote that I looked happy and beautiful, and that maybe she'd made the right choice staying away. I cried reading that because I hadn't been happy. I'd been pretending, performing, trying to be okay for Dad and Anne, while inside I was still that 12-year-old girl who'd lost her mother. Anne and I decided we needed to talk to Dad, not to ambush him, but to help him understand what we were learning. We invited him to dinner at Anne's place. When he walked in and saw our mother sitting there, he stopped dead. "We asked you here to talk," Anne said, "all of us together, like adults." Dad sat down stiffly. I told him we'd been spending time with Mom and Sydney, that we were starting to understand her side of what happened. We weren't excusing her leaving, but we were trying to understand it. Dad said there was nothing to understand. She'd abandoned her family. Mom said she'd left a toxic marriage and then been threatened into staying away. Dad said that was bullshit. He'd only threatened to tell us the truth about her. Sydney asked what truth, and Dad said she was a cheater who'd chosen another man over her children. Mom said yes, she'd had an affair, but she'd wanted to work things out. Dad had refused. He'd given her an ultimatum. Stay and accept his conditions, or leave and never come back. They argued back and forth until Anne shouted for both of them to stop. "It doesn't matter anymore who was right about what happened 13 years ago," she said. "What matters is what we do now." I told Dad I loved him and appreciated everything he'd done raising us alone. But I also said he'd lied to us about Mom being dead, and that it hurt me in ways I was still dealing with. I needed him to accept that Mom was going to be part of our lives now. Dad looked at me for a long time. Then he asked if that's really what I wanted. I said yes. Anne said yes, too. He asked about Sydney, and I said Sydney was our brother and we wanted a relationship with him. Dad nodded slowly and said, "Okay." He tried to accept it. Mom said she wasn't asking Dad to forgive her or even speak to her. She just wanted a chance to know her daughters and for her son to know his sisters. Dad said fine, but he didn't want to be around for it. He'd respect our choices, but he couldn't watch her play happy family after everything she'd done. That hurt, but I understood. Some wounds don't heal just because everyone wants them to. Over the next 2 months, things started feeling more normal. Sydney and Mom began coming to Philadelphia more often, sometimes staying the weekend at a hotel nearby so Sydney wouldn't miss school. The four of us, me, Anne, Sydney, and Mom, started having regular Sunday dinners. Sometimes at Anne's place, sometimes at mine, sometimes at this diner halfway between Philadelphia and Harrisburg. Mom told us stories about her childhood, her parents who'd both passed away years ago, what she'd been like before she'd become the sad woman we'd known. Sydney told us about growing up in Harrisburg, about his friends at school, about learning to cook because Mom worked late shifts. Anne shared stories about raising me after Mom left, how she'd tried to be like a second mother even though she was only 15. I told them about the nightmares I'd had for years, how I'd been afraid to love anyone because what if they disappeared too? One Sunday, Mom brought a photo album she'd kept hidden for years. Pictures of me and Anne as babies, as toddlers, family photos from before everything fell apart. Sydney stared at them like he was trying to memorize every detail. There was one photo of all of us, Mom, Dad, Anne, and me at the beach. Anne was maybe 4, I was 2. We were building a sandcastle, and everyone was smiling. Mom said that was the last good day she remembered before things started getting bad with Dad. Anne asked if she missed him, and Mom said sometimes, not the angry version of him, but the man she'd married, the one who'd made her laugh and held her when she was scared and wanted to build a life with her. I realized then that my parents' marriage hadn't been all bad. There had been love once, before it turned toxic and painful. 3 months after that first meeting with Sydney, Mom did something unexpected. She asked if she could meet Daniel to thank him. If he hadn't recognized her at the wedding and told me, we might never have found each other again. We all met for lunch in Center City. Me, Daniel, Mom, Anne, and Sydney. Mom thanked Daniel for speaking up, even though it had been awkward. She'd been terrified when he'd recognized her. but it had led to getting her daughters back. After lunch, Anne suggested we try inviting both Mom and Dad to the same event to see if they could have a civil conversation. I thought it was a terrible idea, but Anne insisted we couldn't move forward with our family split down the middle. We planned a family barbecue at a park near Anne's place. Public space, other people around. We figured Mom and Dad would have to be civil. The day of the barbecue, I was so nervous I almost canceled. But Sydney sent me a text saying we could do this, that it was time to try. Dad showed up first, then Mom arrived with Sydney. They stared at each other across the picnic area for a minute before Dad walked over. He didn't hug her or anything, but he said hello and asked how she was doing. She said she was okay and asked about him. He said retirement was treating him well, awkward and stiff, but it was something. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, played frisbee. Sydney challenged Dad to horseshoes, and Dad actually smiled. At one point, I saw Dad and Mom standing near the grill talking quietly, not yelling, just talking. Dad was telling her about his new hobby, woodworking. Mom said she'd always wanted to learn that. Dad said maybe Sydney would be interested in learning sometime, that it was good for kids to know how to build things with their hands. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As the sun started setting, we all sat around the picnic table eating watermelon. Anne said we should do this regularly. Sunday dinners were great, but we needed bigger family gatherings too. Everyone agreed. Even Dad nodded. Mom said she wanted to say something. She knew she'd hurt everyone at that table in different ways. She was sorry for leaving, for staying away, for all the years we'd lost. She couldn't change the past, but she wanted to be part of our futures if we'd let her. Dad didn't say he forgave her, but he said we'd all made mistakes and life was too short to stay angry forever. For the sake of his daughters and Sydney, who was just a kid caught up in this mess, he was willing to try to move forward. Mom started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. Last week was my birthday, and for the first time in 13 years, my mother was there to celebrate it. She brought a cake she'd baked herself, chocolate with raspberry filling, which had been my favorite as a kid. The fact that she remembered made me cry. We took a family photo that day, all of us. Dad, Mom, Anne, Troy, Sydney, and me. It was the first photo of all of us together since I was 12. I printed that photo and put it on my fridge. Sometimes I look at it and can't believe this is my life now. My dead mother is alive. I have a brother. My broken family is slowly piecing itself back together. To that elderly woman at the grocery store, thank you. You saw someone following me and you spoke up. You had no idea what you were setting in motion, but because of you, I got my mother back. I found a brother I didn't know existed. My family, fractured by lies and fear and pride, is learning how to be whole again.